there, guys. So our topic of conversation today is the 0 point and how it relates to plane bending. This comes out of a posting that David Ferreger from Connecticut made on the Poi Theory group on Facebook. Specifically, he noticed that we normally think of plane shifting out of stalls and 0 points as a slightly different beast than the idea of plane bending that we do when we're in a weave or in a toroid flower, right? But what Dave noticed was that if you perform that stall in a sloppy kind of manner, the path that the poi follows has more in common with the plane bend than it does the idea of having this point at which the poi head reduces down to 0, which I would totally agree with. I think when it comes to changing the plane the poi is operating in, we essentially have a spectrum of possibilities, and there are extremes on either end of that spectrum. And I definitely agree that one could consider them all flavors of each other, but I think there are specialized cases that we should make sure that we note because they have very unique properties with regard to how the poi moves, right? So to start with, 0 points. These are stalls, and they can be either anti-spin stalls or in-spin stalls. Doesn't matter which flavor you like. They can even be pendulum stalls and point isolations, which are really the same thing too. In all these cases, what we're doing is we're looking for a moment when the acceleration or the momentum of the poi head drops down to 0, even if just for a split second, right? Probably never actually goes completely to 0, or at least if it does, it's in a time frame that we would have a devilishly difficult time measuring. But nonetheless, it is the intention. We're looking for a point at which the poi head's movement collapses down to singularity, and thus we can pull it back out in any plane that is tangent to the point that the poi had arrived at. So, for example, Charlie came up with a very apropos metaphor for describing this, wherein you're essentially working inside of a cone. That is, the poi head finds its way to the tip of that cone, and the hand is working its way towards the center, right? This has some commonalities with the topology that physicists use for understanding gravity wells created in general relativity. That is the way that things like planets and black holes warp space-time. There's a metaphor wherein we think of large objects as essentially weighing down a sheet of rubber, and that sheet of rubber represents what gravity does to space-time. So we could think of the poi as reaching the bottom of that gravity well, and the hand kind of following it down through. And of course, any plane that cuts through that point is totally fair game for us to exit in, right? The other case of this, of course, being with the point isolation, we have a moment in which, when the poi stops, we can move the hand anywhere along a sphere around it. We essentially get 180 degrees to work with, whether it be, you know, going straight up, whether it be going straight down, what have you. Same overall idea that you're reducing the movement of the poi down to singularity, but in this case that singularity is the center of a globe rather than the point of a cone. You could think of these as being kind of two inverted shapes, and the great thing is that they're totally interchangeable. Like, you know, for instance, I could go into an anti-spin stall and make it feel like a point isolation. Or I could go the opposite way, wherein I could take a point isolation and make it feel like the cone type of stall, right? Either which way, there's a nice kind of intellectual consistency to this idea in that we reduce the movement of the poi head down to that singularity, whether it be the center of that black hole or the center of a globe, right? And, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we have more free-form plane bends wherein the hand completely stops moving, and the poi head moves through a series of planes that just basically has access to all of the points that would cover a globe with a radius of 1 poi length from the hand. Now, the hand never completely stops moving. It still needs to imbue the poi with momentum. But, you know, just like the 0 points, the intention is definitely to reduce down to a singularity. And of course, a lot of the plane bends that we're currently working with, such as weaves or toroid flowers, don't fit into either extreme. They kind of are elsewhere along that spectrum. But these are two highly specialized cases, and they're differentiated by the fact that on the poi end of the spectrum we have access both to that globe and the cone, but when the hand reduces its movement, we only have access to the globe. The reason for this is that if I attempted to bring my hand into the center of the cone, or the tip of it, excuse me, I can't push back out the poi in any direction that I see fit. This isn't a problem with rigid props. In fact, when you perform anti-spin with either a staff or a club, what you're in fact doing is switching off which object is at the tip of the cone. That is, hand's the tip of the cone, tip is the center of the cone, or tip of the cone, excuse me. Hand is the tip of the cone, tip of the tool is the tip of the cone, so on and so forth, right? But this works first because the prop is rigid and doesn't have to work with gravity. There's also another reason. When we first learn weaves, we usually do so inside of a very limited range of movement. And when we start working with toroid flowers, there's usually a little bit of a hump to get over in terms of movement. And it's no coincidence. A lot of us have played with 0 points before we've played with toroids, and I think only part of that is due to the fact that we've only been expanding the toroid vocabulary very recently. The other reason is a physical concept called precession, which is, everybody who's ever learned how to ride a bike knows this concept, because once you get that bike moving and a little bit of speed under it, you'll find it's easier to stay aloft on the bike than it is when it's moving slowly. The reason is that there's a kind of physical inertia that happens with any rotating body, wherein when you take it off axis, it tends to pitch, right? If you're going very rapidly on a bike, if you try and lean over, it's automatically going to turn into the turn a little bit to try and right itself. And likewise, when you start playing around with plane bending with a poi, it feels a little bit more awkward, and it takes a little bit more energy to redirect the angle of the poi plane than it, say, does to reduce the poi's movement down to 0 and then take it back out in a different plane. When you're dealing with rigid props, it's not as much of an issue because you don't have to keep the prop moving around in a circle in order to, keep it moving through the pattern. So in the case of poi, I think 0 points are really helpful because they note those cases wherein we are working around the precession problem. And in the case of this type of movement, I think Nick Woolsey has dubbed this before orbing. I'm sure Arashi has another term for it, but I don't know where it is off the top of my head. So basically, yeah, that's my 2 cents. Oops, ran out of room on the camera. Yeah, sorry about that. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. Have yourselves a great week. Peace.